Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular halacha class in our series leading up to Pesach. Our topic for this morning, our topic for this evening is Kitniyot, the minhag of Ashkenazim, and here and there a few Sephardic communities as well, not many Sephardic communities, to refrain not only from eating chametz, which the Torah prohibits, but also refraining from all kinds of beans and legumes and stuff like you see on the illustration. Well, let's see what the great poskim have to say. We're going to begin by clarifying the spectrum of thinking amongst the different Rabbanim, amongst the different poskim, regarding the definition of what is kitniyot, what falls into this prohibited category. Well, let's get the stuff on the screen. If you have any questions during the class, feel free to type your question, and then I can incorporate the answer into the ongoing class. What is kitniyot, or what is not kitniyot? What falls into this category? I want to begin with the tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, surely the greatest of the Rabbanim in North America in the 20th century, on anyone's short list of all-time great Rabbanim. And as in all of my classes, I'm going to present to you only the sources of the great poskim, not obscure opinions, as interesting as they may be, we're not going to deal with in this series. Here's the tshuva of the Igros Moshe, and since you have the exact precise source on the screen, I don't have to mention where I drew this text from. If you want to look it up and see my typographical errors, feel free. Hine bidvar hapinat, regarding something called a peanut. In Israel today, peanuts are called botnim. In some countries, they're called Spanish nuts. In some places, even in the English-speaking world, they're called goobers. Well, everyone knows what peanuts are. Are peanuts kitniyot, and therefore prohibited on Pesach, or not? Well, here goes Reb Moshe Feinstein's definition of what is and what is not kitniyot. B'harbe mekomot, in many places, achlu otam b'Pesach. Back in Europe, back in the old days when he was originally from Eastern Europe, and back in Europe, some people were eating peanuts on Pesach. Others weren't. Kvod Torah Toharama, that's an honorific expression. Kvod Torah Toharama, that's an honorific expression for the person who asked the question. You who asked me the question about peanuts, Tama b'tama davar, you were wondering about the reason for refraining from peanuts, or the reason for permitting peanuts. You're wondering what the underlying concept is. Mishum sheshama she'osim mimenu be'ezer makom gam kemach. After all, it's quite possible to grind peanuts and make kemach, make some kind of flour out of them, knead the dough, and make something like a cake or something. I mean, you can use peanuts very much the way you use real chametz. So maybe it should be included in the category of kitniyot. Gam shamash and nizra'im b'sadot kishar kitniyot. And the peanuts are sown, that's planted, not the tefira, not the they're planted. Peanuts are planted in the field just like all the other kitniyot. So from the agricultural point of view, Peanuts seem to fall into the category of kitniyot because agriculturally, the way they're grown is very similar to other kitniyot. And from the kitchen point of view, they can be used in the kitchen the way chametz is used, and therefore, shouldn't it be prohibited? The questioner is assuming that kitniyot is defined by number one, the way farmers grow it, or number two, the way it's used in the kitchen. If it's grown like chametz is grown, or if it's used in the kitchen the way chametz is used, no good. That's the assumption of the questioner. Well, ain't ze Indian clown, but you're all wrong. Your assumptions are all wrong. This is not the correct way. This is not the proper way to define what is and what is not kitniyot. Ein lecha davar ha'osim mimenu kemach k'tapuchei adama. After all, there's nothing more similar to chametz than potato flour, potato starch. Even in my own home here, we make cakes and all kinds of baked goods on Pesach out of potato starch, potato flour. That's used in the kitchen exactly, precisely the same way that we use real chametz. Lo rak b'medina zo, not only here in America, ela gam b'Europe. Back in the old days, when people were really from, they were using potato flour in Europe, potato starch, gam b'dorot hakodmim, and this has been going on for generations. Well, if the definition of kitniyot depends on the way you use it in the kitchen, then of course potato starch, potato flours would have to be prohibited. But no one ever heard of prohibiting that, and therefore this definition of kitniyot must be wrong. Me'olam lo chashu le'esor zeh. No one ever had in mind to block people, to prohibit people from using potato flour, potato starch. And therefore, the way you use it in the kitchen to bake things like bread or cake, that's not a valid criterion. Lachen, therefore, ein lanu b'davar ela masha mifurash shenahagu le'asor. Therefore, the only correct way, at least according to Moshe Feinstein, according to the text on the screen, the only correct way to know what is and what is not kitniyot depends entirely upon minhag, entirely upon your practice. What did you refrain from eating last year? What did you eat last year on Pesach? Well, things you did eat last year on Pesach, you apparently have no minhag, no custom to refrain from, and therefore it's not kitniyot. Things you did refrain from eating in previous years on Pesach, well, you apparently have a minhag to refrain from that. That's kitniyot. Kitniyot depends what is and what is not. Kitniyot depends entirely upon what in the past you have refrained from eating. V'chein, and similarly, ma sheyadua u'mifursam. In order for a minhag to be valid, it must be a well-known practice, quite well-known. We're talking here about, there are two categories of minhag. The minhag we're talking about here is minhag hamakom, local practice. If in a community, Warsaw, Baghdad, if in a certain Jewish community it is well known and well publicized and everyone knows that the Jews there refrain from eating this or refrain from eating that, whether we're talking about a specific Pesach question or all year long, a kashrus issue, the minhag hamakom, The local practice is defined not only by what people do, but more precisely, what people do that is well known and well recognized. And the rule is, incidentally, that minhag hamakom, local practice, where it exists, governs even visitors who are just passing through the community. For example, a, uh, uh, a Jew from Baghdad who normally eats rice every Pesach is on a business trip in Europe and he's passing through Warsaw on Pesach. And Warsaw is an Ashkenazi community where they do not eat rice on Pesach. That visitor from Baghdad, although every year he has been eating rice on Pesach, no objection to that because he is from the Edot Mizrach, from the Eastern communities. But as long as he is physically visiting in the Ashkenaz community, you're not allowed to violate local practice. And therefore, as long as he's there, he's not allowed to eat rice or any other kitniyot. Well, when I say as long as he's physically there in Warsaw, there is defined by Tchum Shabbat, the distance one is allowed to walk outside of town on Shabbat. Every village, every town, every city is surrounded by a Tchum Shabbat. The distance you're allowed to leave your village, the distance you're allowed to walk out of your town on Shabbat, and within that territory, local minhag hamakom reigns and governs even visitors who are passing through. That's minhag hamakom, which must be yadua umifursam, something well known in the community. The other category of minhag is not minhag hamakom, but your private, personal practices. You, as an individual person, might accept upon yourself a chumrah, a strict practice above and beyond what halacha requires, and you might wish to refrain from this or refrain from that all year long in some general kashrus issue or on Pesach. You might wish to accept upon yourself some personal, private, strict position, and that becomes your personal minhag. Well, of course, this governs only you and not visitors in town. Your Jewish neighbors are not bound by your humrot, by your strict practices. That's on the screen at the moment. Ramosha is talking about minhag hamakom, which must be well known. So if you're in a place where, yeah, only chumrot are minhagim, not kulot. The 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 if you're in a place where the Torah observant Jews are have a minhag not to do this or not to do that, even visitors passing through are stuck with that. Um, he continues. This is still the tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Gam yesh liten ta'am ledin esa b'minhag. In order for a minhag to be valid, there must be some reason for it. If it's just some silly, stupid practice that you have accepted upon yourself, that's not a minhag. In order for a minhag to be valid, there must be some reason to it. It must be reasonable. After all, minhag is something very different than halacha. Halacha flows out of the decisions of the Hachamim. Back in the days of the Sanhedrin, they legislated halacha. Nowadays, Rabbanim have their opinions, and what is halacha flows out of the opinions of the Chachamim. It's the rabbis who decide what halacha is. What about minhag? אלא שהנהיגו את העם להחמיר שלא לאכול מינים אלה שהיה מצוי לאוכלם מפני טעמים דחשש מיני דגן. But rabbis advised people. They did not instruct the people that halacha prohibits them from eating kitniyot. They advised the people, they recommended to the people that they refrain from eating certain grains, shenit arvu, which are typically mixed with chametz. Well, what does that mean? If I go to the health food store all year long, where I buy all kinds of beans and legumes and grains and rice, and I buy all kinds of things in the health food store, and I buy a bag of rice, 1 kilo bag. I buy a kilo of lentils, 1 kilo bag. I do this frequently. And of course, in the store, they are packaging their products in 1 kilo bags. And not surprisingly, since they use the same machine to pack lentils and rice and wheat kernels and rye kernels and oats, since they use the same machine to package these 1 kilo bags, it's not surprising that occasionally in a bag, even more than occasionally, in a bag of rice, you'll find a lentil or two. In a bag of lentils, you'll find a wheat kernel or two because the same machinery is used for packing. That's true in my local health food store, and that's equally true in large factories where they package these things by the ton and they get marketed all over the place. The same machinery is used for packing real chametz, wheat products, rye products, spelt products, and kitniyot, and therefore they typically get mixed together in the packaging, and therefore the rabbis advise the people refrain from eating these products where real chametz is often mixed in. Kasher livdok, and it's difficult to pick up the rice grain by grain to make sure that there are no foreign particles, no foreign grains mixed in with the rice. It's a lot of work to pick over the rice one grain at a time to make sure there are no wheat kernels, no rye, no oats or anything else in it. And then once you've ground it into flour, now it's impossible to check it. אבל כיוון שלא תקנו בקיבוץ חכמים לאכול דברים שיש חשש שיתערבו במנהג דוגן, but the rabbis never got together and legislated any prohibition to eat kidneys. Not back in the days of the Sanhedrin, where the rabbis had the authority. And if the Sanhedrin had wished to, they could have legislated a prohibition to eat rice, but they didn't. The Gemara makes this perfectly clear. And in the post-Talmudic times, after the destruction of the Second Temple, when the Sanhedrin no longer exists, our rabbis no longer have the authority to legislate new halacha like this. Devarim shosim mehem kemach, even if we're talking about things that you can make dough and bake. But bottom line, since we're talking only about a minhag, the rabbis encouraged the people to refrain from eating rice and certain other things, and what the people accepted upon themselves, the practices that the people accepted upon themselves, not to eat this, not to eat that, that became kitniyos. But the source of authority came from the people, creating minhag hamakom, creating local practice. And there are all kinds of things, all kinds of products, which did not exist in earlier generations. Um, I'm old enough to remember, I'm not that old, I'm old enough to remember when soybeans and soya products came to the Western world. In my parents' and grandparents' generation, not so long ago, no one had ever heard of soya products, much less oil made from soya. Back then, there was no practice to refrain from eating soya products because soya products simply didn't exist in Europe or North America. And, well, of course there was no minhag. Lachen, tapuchei adama shelo hayu mitzuim az, potatoes, which came from the New World before Columbus, before Europeans came to North America. Well, actually, potatoes come from Central and South America. But before potatoes came from the Americas to Europe, of course, there was no minhag. Um, of course, one of the elements of minhag is that the acceptance of a minhag upon yourself, whether it's your own personal minhag or community minhag, it must be well known and publicized that it's not a halacha, that the people chose to accept this minhag upon themselves. If you individually or the community as a whole make a mistake and refrain from something, mistakenly believing that it's halachically prohibited, that's not a minhag, that's just a mistake. And when you discover that there's really no halachic prohibition, you don't have a minhag to refrain from it. In order for a minhag to be valid, you must know that halachically you are allowed to eat it or do it, whatever the minhag is, and you choose to refrain from it. Well, of course, there's no old minhag to refrain from potatoes. And therefore, uh, the definition of kitniyot depends entirely upon minhag. Here's the end of his tshuva, where he summarizes the ideas very clearly. Let's talk about peanuts more specifically. That was the question, after all, that he was asked. Let's deal with lo asur b'harmim kamot. In many Ashkenaz communities, they're eating peanuts on Pesach. B'makom shaleka minhag ein le'asor. And if they have no minhag to refrain from eating peanuts, there's no reason to tell them to stop eating it. Ki b'dvarim ka'ela ein lahachmir. After all, minhag, in order to be binding, must be something that you would decide yourself to accept upon yourself. And if in previous years you were eating peanuts, no reason to. Well, if you wish, you can take upon yourself the minhag and stop eating peanuts this year if you wish. But if you've been eating peanuts in previous years, you're surely not bound by any minhag to refrain from eating peanuts this year or in the future. Those who in previous years have refrained from eating peanuts, not because peanuts were unavailable in the market. They simply couldn't have eaten peanuts even if they wanted to, but peanuts were available and they decided not to eat the peanuts. People who made the decision not to eat peanuts, they are not allowed to eat peanuts. So, since the rule is safek d'Rabbanan l'kula, since the rule is whenever there's a safek, a doubt about the application of a rabbinic law, one should be lenient, all the more so. Safek minhag l'kula, all the more so when there is a doubt about whether or not to apply a minhag, leniency is called for. And therefore, when if someone asks, Rabbi, am I blocked from eating peanuts? The rabbi asks, well, what about previous years? Have you been eating peanuts in previous years? If the answer is yes, I've been eating them, no problem. You can eat them this year. If the answer is no, I've refrained in previous years from peanuts, the answer is you have a minhag to refrain and it applies this year as well. If the answer is I don't remember, I don't know whether I've been refraining from peanuts, I'm in doubt, the the answer is lakula, lenient, and you're allowed to eat peanuts. In order for the minhag to be binding, it must be clear and not subject to safek, not subject to doubt. Lachein shayak sheyitein hechsher shalon nitarev sham chametz yochlu elu, and therefore it's quite proper to give a hechsher to a package of peanuts in the store, guaranteeing that it's been checked over and to be sure that there's no chametz mixed in, quite proper to give a hechsher to a package of peanuts in the market so that those who have no minhag to refrain can buy it and eat it on Pesach. V'chein ra'iti shenotnim hechsher al peanut oil, and that's why it's quite proper to give a hechsher for Pesach to peanut oil, shemen botnim, mahai time for this reason, because there's surely no minhag hamakum to refrain from it, and individuals will have to know their own personal minhag, whether to refrain from peanut oil or to use it, depending upon what they've done in previous years. Bottom line, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, what is and what is not Kitniyot depends upon minhag. What have you individually, or what has your community as a whole in previous years refrained from? If you personally have refrained from something in previous years, you have a personal minhag not to do it or not to eat it. If it's a communal matter, then there's a minhag hamakom to refrain from it, and even visitors passing through the community are bound by that. That's the approach of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Kitniyot is a minhag and governed from beginning to end by the principles of minhag. Now here comes a very different opinion. I'm quoting the Madrich HaKashrut, published yearly by the Eda Haredit, the Kashrus agency in Mea She'arim here in Yerushalayim. They say, Hagdarat Kitniyot, the definition of what is and what is not Kitniyot, Hainu, namely, Kol Davar Shezorim Oto B'Zir Onim, anything which is planted in the fields as seeds. You plant seeds. The farmer plants seeds, umatzmiach rak garinim, and the plant grows seeds, vazer atzmo nechol, and that's what you eat. Some plants, like apple trees, you plant the seeds, but then when the tree grows, you don't eat the seeds, you eat the apples. Other plants, like wheat or rice, you plant the seeds, the plant grows, and you eat the seeds that grow. That is Kitniyot according to the Eda Haredis. If you're a guest in someone's home where the host is lenient and the guest is lenient, one is lenient, one is strict regarding a certain minhag, then the host is not allowed to serve the guest whatever the guest refrains from. And if it's the host who's the strict one, well, the guest is just not going to be served that food while in that home. So the first definition of kitniyos is any seed which is planted. When the plant grows, you eat the seeds. V'chol shegadel al eitz, anything which grows on a tree, like apples, that's not kitniyos. Lachein, therefore, bepule kafe, as far as coffee beans are concerned, coffee beans, they are beans, but they're not kitniyos because they grow on a tree. If you're in Yerushalayim, you can go to the Botanic Gardens in Nayot, go to the hothouse in the back left. In the hothouse here in Yerushalayim, in Nayot, in the botanical gardens, they have a coffee tree growing, and you can usually see the pods of the coffee growing on the coffee tree. Mahmirim le'esor gam shemen botnim, shemen kutna, anything which is kitniyos, we prohibit also the oil, which is pressed from that. This is the position of the Eda Haredis. Very different definition of kitniyos, very different from Rav Moshe Feinstein. According to the Eda Haredis, the definition of kitniyos is not dependent on minhag. It's dependent on the way the plant grows on the farm. If you plant the seeds and the plant grows and you eat the seeds, that's kitniyot. If it grows on a tree, like chocolate beans or cocoa beans or coffee beans, that's not kitniyot. That's a very different definition. According to this, um, peanuts are clearly kitniyot because you plant the peanuts in the field, the plant grows, and then it's the peanuts which you eat. Very different than apples, where you don't eat the apple seeds, I hope. Here's a whole third approach, and this is the third approach. We have only three approaches. The first was Rav Moshe Feinstein. The second was the Eda Haredis. Now, Nittei Gavriel presents us with the third understanding of Kitniyot. Siper Morenu Rabbeinu Papa Zecher Tzadik Levracha. The great rabbi of Papa uh, told us, in the name of Hagon, Harav, Hatzadik, Mebelz, Zvachuso Yagen Aleinu, he learned from the great Belzer rabbi, Amar, Tam Dechol Machle Pesach Tzrichim Shmiru. Everything you eat on Pesach requires shmira, careful watching. Careful. You have to be careful about everything you eat on Pesach. Everything requires care on Pesach. Well, lo yehei b'hem mashu chametz. We want to be very careful about everything we eat on Pesach, that chas v'shalom, heaven forbid, no chametz should be mixed in it. Well, but bottom line, everything depends upon what HaKadosh Baruch Hu, everything depends upon what God wants. We depend, bottom line, on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, on God protecting us, that we shouldn't, heaven forbid, eat any chametz inadvertently by mistake on Pesach. All the kinds of foods which they used to eat in earlier generations when the great rabbis lived, back in the days of the great Hasidic rabbis, back in the days of the great Sephardic rabbis, all the kinds of foods which they had in those days, kvar hitpalalu aleim. The great rabbis in earlier generations davened. The great rabbis in earlier generations prayed that the Jews should be saved from violating the prohibition of chametz. They prayed that we be saved from inadvertently, mistakenly eating some chametz when consuming the foods that they had in those days. Asubim derechem avolat tefillah, the kinds of foods which the earlier generations had, those were the foods which were included in the prayers of the great rabbis. Lachein, therefore, therefore we too should be praying that we don't accidentally consume chametz on Pesach. But the new kinds of foods which we have today, uh, the soybeans, mung beans, the new kinds of foods which we have today that they didn't have in earlier generations. The great rabbis in the early generations did not daven about these kinds of foods because they didn't have them, they didn't know about them. We are not worthy of God's protection. We are not on the spiritual level of the older rabbis, and therefore on Pesach we eat only the kinds of foods which they were eating in the old days for Pesach. Any newfangled food which comes onto the market, well, that's to be refrained from on Pesach. So this is the third approach. It's not a matter of minhag. It's not a matter of how the farmers grow the food. It's rather a matter of what your great-grandparents were eating, the kinds of foods that your great-grandparents were eating in the village in Poland, in the village in Morocco, wherever they came from. Those are the foods which the great rabbis then prayed that you should be saved from any accidental violation, and those are the foods we eat on Pesach. Anything new falls under the category of kitniyot. Did the great rabbis in earlier centuries use citric acid as an additive in their food? Of course not. It didn't exist yet. Therefore, no citric acid should be added to any of the foods you eat, and so forth and so on. Anything new is prohibited. That's the Nitei Gavriel in the name of the Belzer Rebbe. Okay, so now that we know that there are different definitions of Kitniyot, now we want to know what the halachot of Kitniyot are. What are the specific rules and regulations? Once we've decided which of the three approaches we're going to follow, now what are the specific rules and regulations? Well, the Mishnah Brura teaches us, Pasha, it's perfectly clear. The lechola, someone who is sick, af she'en bo sakana, we're not talking about a life-threatening situation. Someone whose life is in danger, you do whatever you have to do to save a person's life. But even where there's no question of life and death, there's no doubt about it, this person's not going to die. It's just an ordinary routine disease, which person's going to get better in a few days. But at the moment this person is sick, mutar levashel lo kitniyot, perfectly acceptable to cook kitniyot, to cook rice or any other form of kitniyot, in tzarich lazeh, if that's what is needed. If eating rice is going to help the sick person, then by all means cook rice and feed it to the sick person. Um, uh, if it would be a life-threatening condition, well, of course, life-threatening conditions set aside almost all other considerations. אבל צריך לבדוק ולברור יפה יפה בדקדוק היטב. But if you're going to cook rice for a sick person on Pesach, you must check the rice very carefully. Um, the Sephardic practice in those communities which do eat rice, the Sephardic practice is to pick over the grains of rice one at a time and examine each grain of rice to make sure that no foreign grains have been mixed in, and that examination, the picking over of the rice, should be done 3 times before Pesach, preferably, and should be done in a room where there are no children present. The b'dika, the examination of the rice or the lentils or whatever kind of kitniyot it is, should be done 3 times, grain by grain, in a room where no children are present. If you have children running around in the room, then of course, what is going to happen is the child is going to say, I want to help. Oh, and once the child starts helping, all is lost. And therefore, the examination should be done in a room where there are no children present. The kidneys has to be checked over grain by grain to make sure that there's no chametz mixed in with it. The Chatam Sofer wrote, this is the Mishnah Brura quoting the Chatam Sofer, Afil b'makom sheyesh latir, even in a situation where we are permitting kitniyot, like for a sick person, makom, in any event, yachlitenu lechatchila. Nonetheless, it would be preferable to pour the kitniyot into boiling water. First, boil up the water, and then pour the rice into boiling water. The reason this would be preferable is because the Gemara says, back in those days, the Gemara says, if you take ordinary flour, on Pesach, you take ordinary flour and you pour the flour into boiling water to cook it up, that is permitted on Pesach because it cannot turn into chametz because the boiling water cooks it up so quickly, much less than 18 minutes. The boiling water cooks it up so quickly that it cannot turn into chametz. So Medina de Gemara, according to what the Gemara says, chalita, pouring wheat flour into boiling water, is permitted on Pesach. Since the days of the Gaonim, since the early post-Talmudic period, almost every Jewish community has accepted upon itself not to do this. The one big exception being the Italian Jews. Before the Holocaust, the Italian Jewish communities used to distribute flour before Pesach to the Jewish members of the community, and they had all kinds of recipes where on Pesach they would pour the flour into boiling water and make all kinds of recipes with it. Aside from the Italian, well, not much left of the Italian communities since the Holocaust, but in pre-Holocaust Italy, that was still common. Aside from that, chalita is no longer practiced in any Jewish community, but if you are cooking kitniyot for a sick person, pour it into boiling water. That's an advisable practice according to the Chatam Sofer. Now, up to this point, everything that everything that we've learned is fairly simple and straightforward. Now we come to what I view as the biggest problem in Kitniyot. The Ramah, the Ashkenaz commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, tells us, Yesh Omrim Kitniyot bePesach. When the Ramah says Yesh Omrim, some people block, some people prohibit eating Kitniyot on Pesach, some people. That's the way the Ramah always expresses the practice of the Ashkenaz team. Ashkenazim do not eat kitniyot on Pesach. A minhag ba'Ashkenaz lahachmir. Throughout Ashkenaz, that's a minhag ha'makam. That's a local practice in every Ashkenaz Jewish community, ein lishanot, and that should not be changed. Those are the words of the Ramah. But then the Ramah continues, and these are still the words of the Ramah in his comments on the Shulchan Aruch. Mihu, however, pashut, it's obvious. De'ein osrim b'diavad im naflu letoch hatavshil. If some kitniyot fell into the food while you are cooking it, there's no reason to prohibit it. After all, refraining from kitniyot is only a minhag, and therefore, if some rice or other kitniyot fell into the food while you are cooking it, no reason to be strict. Of course you can eat the food. V'chein mutar lehadlik b'shmanim hana'asim mehem. And similarly, there's no objection to lighting your candles, oil lamps. There's no objection to using kitniyot oil for oil lamps. Ein osrim im naflu letoch hatavshil. Bottom line, if kitniyot falls into the food, we do not prohibit it. Ashkenazim do not prohibit it on Pesach. V'chein mutar lehashot min kitniyot ubayit. And there's also no prohibition to have kitniyot in your house on Pesach. Rice does not have to be sold to a non-Jew. Just put it aside on Pesach. And if somehow it falls into the food is still going to be permitted. That's what the Ramah teaches us in his comments on the Shulchan Aruch. If kitniyot inadvertently, by mistake, somehow fall into the food, which could happen, we do not prohibit the food. Now, what exactly does it mean? What exactly did the Ramah mean when he said some kitniyot fell accidentally into the food? Well, let's see the way the great rabbis in subsequent generations understand this Ramah. First, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, written by the Balatanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, he said, Ein chosheshin shema yipol me'ashemen ner letoch hatavshil. If you have an oil lamp on the table, or an oil lamp hanging over the table, and the oil lamp is kitniyot oil, corn oil or soybean oil or something like that, even though it's quite possible, and perhaps some drops of oil will fall into the food because the oil lamp is hanging over the table, that could happen. Afim yipol l'tocho ma'at shemen, even if some kitniyot oil falls into the soup on Pesach, harehu mitpatel b'tocho berov, as long as the kitniyot is less than 50% of the mixture, as long as kitniyot is less than 50% of the mixture, I say it a third time, as long as kitniyot is less than 50% of the mixture, minhag since we're talking only about a minhag and not something which is truly prohibited, the rule is not patal b'shishim, 1 part in 60, which is the normal rule in kashrus, but the rule of 1 part in 60 has to do with foods that are prohibited. Kitniyot is only a minhag, and therefore the rule is not 1 part in 60, the rule is minority, as long as the kitniyot is less than 50% of the mixture, all is well. I'll give you a few examples. You'll understand right away how it works. An Ashkenazi is visiting in a Sephardic household where a little bit of kitniyot gets mixed into the salad, into so some kitniyot got mixed into the chicken recipe, into whatever recipe it is, as long as it's only a little bit of kitniyot that got mixed into the recipe, a little bit, less than 50% by volume, less than 50% by volume of the recipe is kitniyot, there's no objection to the Ashkenazim eating it. That is the way the Shulchan Aruch Harav, that is the way the Baal HaTanya understood the Ramah. He was, of course, Hasidic. Let's look at what the how the Chai he was Litvish, he was by the opposite end of the spectrum, not Hasidic at all. Let's see how he understood the Ramah. B'diavad, im nafal min ha-kitniyot letoch ha-tavshil, if some kitniyot got mixed into the food for Pesach, mutar im yesh rov beheter, as long as a majority, more than 50% of the food is not kitniyot, all is well. Once again, the Chai agrees with the Baal HaTanya on the previous screen. Mixtures, ta'arovot, a mixture, a ta'arovet, which contains kitniyos in it, as long as the kitniyos is less than 50%, all is well. Now think about all the products that you might buy in the stores for Pesach here in Israel. Of course, here in Israel, the population is approximately evenly divided between those of Ashkenaz and those of Sephardic origin, and therefore our stores here are chock full of kosher LePesach products made by Sephardic food producers for a Sephardic community, and they have kitniyos in them. Well, if we're talking about a chocolate bar or any other product which has some kitniyot in it, but less than 50%, then that chocolate bar or whatever it is perfectly acceptable for Ashkenazim as well. Now, of course, some products are mayonnaise, margarine. If products like this are made with kitniyot, here the kitniyot is almost 100% of the mixture. It's surely more than 50%, and therefore a product like mayonnaise or margarine, if made with kitniyot, in all likelihood, the kitniyot is close to 100%, surely more than 50% of the product, and therefore unacceptable for Ashkenazim. According to the Hasidic practice, the Baal HaTanya, according to the Litvish practice, the Chai Adam, kitniyot is prohibited if it's a majority of the mixture. Mishnah Brura, surely no more authoritative posek in the 20th century than the Mishnah Brura, says, Tocha Tavshil, when the Ramah said that some kitniyot fell into the food, Mairi, he was talking about Yesh al kol panim rov beheter. He was talking about a case where at least the majority of the food is not kitniyot. If the amount of kitniyot which fell into the food is less than a majority, all is well. I could go on and on and on. I mean, how many sources do we need of great Ashkenaz rabbis, all of whom agree that when the Ramah taught us that although there's a minhag to refrain from kitniyot, nonetheless, if some kitniyot fall into the mixture, less than 50%, all is well, and you can eat the kitniyot. Let's talk about a more practical example. If, once again, the Ashkenaz guest is in a Sephardic household, and uh, in the Sephardic household, they wish to serve chicken soup with rice in it, well, the Ashkenaz guest should say, please, I want the chicken soup without the rice. So they say, oh, we already put the rice into the chicken soup. Well, take the rice out, and of course, the little bit of rice which will remain in the soup after an attempt was made to remove the rice, that little bit that remains in the soup is going to be less than 50%, and the soup is acceptable for Ashkenaz consumers. Imoken, if a majority of the mixture is kitniyot, products in Israel don't tell you if it's 50% or not, but usually it's obvious because usually if you look at the list of ingredients, you'll see the only thing which is kitniyot is some very minor part of the product. If the mixture is a majority of kitniyot, well, mikre tarova, that's not called a mixture at all. Mixtures which have a minority of kitniyot are acceptable. But if it's a majority of kitniyot, that's not called a mixture. That's called kitniyot. The identity of the mixture depends upon its majority. The halachic identity of the mixture depends upon whatever the component is that's more than 50%. If it's more than 50% kitniyos, then that's the identity of the whole mixture, and for Ashkenazim, no good, like mayonnaise or margarine made with Kitniyot products. Um, Less than 50%, all the big name poskim have no problem for Ashkenazim eating a mixture containing less than 50%. Now, here I have a list on the screen of the various foods which nowadays our kashrus organizations, the Ashkenaz kashrus organizations, are prohibiting from use on Pesach. Uh, these are the foods which most kashrus organizations, the OU in the United States, the Beth Din in London, and so forth and so on, these are the foods which the Ashkenaz kashrus organizations consider minhag hamakom. It's the local practice throughout the Ashkenaz world to refrain from these things. And you'll notice that among the products corn, that's maize, in Commonwealth English, maize, in North American English, corn, even though corn or maize is also an American product which came to Europe only in post-Columbian times, nonetheless, when corn, maize, tiras first appeared in Europe, the Jews made a decision to refrain from it, and therefore that became part of the minhag hamakom for Pesach. Uh, in retrospect, that might have been a mistake that the communities made, but in fact, the Ashkenaz communities have refrained from corn or maize, tiras in Hebrew, even though that arrived only recently in Europe. Tov, in any event, these are the basic principles of Kitniyot, which I wanted to present to you today. I'm going to pause at this time. If you have any questions, feel free to pose them. And I wish you a good week and a safe and quiet week and good preparations for Pesach. And we look forward to seeing you all again in the continuation of Web Yeshiva after Chodesh Nisan, after Pesach. Are there any questions that you would like to pose at this time?
Just wishing you a wonderful, safe, and fun and everything, Chag, Rabbi.
Same to you. Thank you for your wishes.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Rabbi Fink, when I first started being from a lot of years ago, my rabbi said not to have garlic on Pesach.
About garlic.
Yeah. He said,
Yeah,
I think he said it was very sharp.
there is no minhag hamakom to refrain from garlic. Some individuals do refrain from it, and that's a private minhag. If in previous years you've used garlic, no objection.
Okay, because now I'm living in Israel and most of my friends use a lot of garlic. So
Yes,
it's
of
okay
course.
for
And
me to eat.
the market is full of fresh garlic this time of year.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
it's
think,
okay. Just why is
Thank you.
carob? Yeah,
Rabbi,
why is carob on the list? Well, because communities decided to refrain from eating carob.
Rabbi Fink,
Yes.
one of the things about garlic, the Hungarian community did not eat garlic, which is for them not breathing, not to have garlic, because it was grown in the field together with wheat. And it took a long time for my mother to realize it was okay to use garlic with proper hechsher on it. It was a hard time convincing her, but that's basically where the prohibition of eating garlic. And for Hungarian, that's, as I say, it's like not to breathe.
Well, of course, your mother and other Jews who have a personal minhag to refrain from garlic, for them it is kitniyot, and they should refrain from eating it. But if you have no minhag, no personal minhag, or if you're in doubt about whether you have a personal minhag, leniency is the way to go.
Okay, Rabbi, I have a question. Are we obligated to follow the minhag of our parents if we don't agree? If we're in Israel now?
If while you were growing up you followed the minhag of your parents, then you have accepted the minhag upon yourself and you're stuck with it. But of course, not everyone grows up in the home of their parents, and therefore, if you grow up not in the home of your parents, so of course you're not going to be accepting their minhag upon yourself. And there are children who grow up not accepting the minhag of their parents. This is particularly common when you have a family living in a different minhag group. You have an Ashkenaz family living in Sephardic territory or the other way around. Quite commonly, the children grow up following the minhag of the other Jews and not the minhag of their parents. Uh, if, in fact, the children grow up following the minhag of the parents, which is the normal, statistically the most common thing, then yes, the children have accepted upon themselves the minhag of the parents.
Okay, but it's different to follow the rules because it's your parents' house, even whether you agree with it or not.
Yes, well, of course, you cannot serve food to someone which violates the guest's minhag. If the children are helping the parents prepare food or bringing food to the parents, of course, you cannot serve anyone food which violates the minhag of the person eating it.
Okay, so if you grew up not agreeing with your parents because they just did it because their parents did it and nobody really thought about what the reason was. For instance, I grew up actually on string beans.
Mm-hmm.
And when two different grandparents would be at the house and one agreed with it and one didn't, so everybody switched the vegetable to something else eventually. It just made, more peace in the family, but it's like,
Okay, that's good.
anyway. Okay, thank you very much. This was very interesting.
Thank you, thank you. Let us then pause with this and I wish you a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Shalom, shalom.
Hashem Sameach. Thank you.
Pesach Sameach. Thank
Yes,
you.
it's-
You're welcome. You're welcome.